Hello, I'm David Bellos, and the title of this talk is The Music of Les Misérables. But actually, you could perhaps better call it The Missing Chapter, because it's something that I consciously left out of my book on the novel of the century. Now, Boublil and Schoenberg, wonderful as they are, were not the first to think of adding music to Les Misérables. Far from it, because actually music is present in Hugo's actual novel right from the start, in the text itself. Now, obviously, there aren't any scores in the text, but the story, the plot, the whole fabric of this great work presupposes that readers can recognize and hear in their minds the many tunes that characters sing or hum or whistle. Because, Hugo wanted his novel to be this great panorama of French society in the 19th century, with its classes made manifest through their distinctive clothing, their jobs, their housing, their incomes, their means of locomotion, all sorts of other things, including, of course, alongside those more sort of tangible, visible features of social life, the cultural features, the musical culture of a world in which mechanical noise had not yet drowned out that most common of pastimes, namely singing in the street. Okay, so what I want to try out with you today is a reconstruction of that lost world of 19th century French sound. I apologize now and forever in the future for doing this in an amateur way. I am not a musicologist. I'm also not a very good operator of the technology I'm using today, but I'm going to do my best. I'd also like to thank all the many people I'm indebted to who've helped me, both technically and in a scholarly sense. But most of all, those anonymous bloggers on various fan sites I've been able to track down who have given me clues and who have themselves done some quite excellent research into the origins of the music of Les Misérables. So thanks a heap. Some of you may be listening to me, and if you are, well done. And I hope you don't object to my reusing your finds without crediting you, because I don't know what your names are. Okay, let me now share a screen. I'm going to have to do this many times, and I apologize for the minor delay that this creates. It is well known, I'm sure you all know, that Victor Hugo, a man of infinitely many talents, was not musical. That was the one talent he really didn't have. He played no instrument, and he could not sing in tune. And that caused him no little embarrassment during his exile on Guernsey, because on those islands, as throughout the British Empire, it was obligatory, and in fact it was right down to when I was a boy in the 1960s, at the end of any performance of a concert or a play, the audience had to stand and sing God Save the Queen. And Hugo, of course, he stood up like everybody else in the little theatre in St. Peter Port in Guernsey, but he kept his mouth shut. And of course, local subjects of Her Majesty suspected this notorious French Republican of snubbing the Queen by keeping his mouth shut. And it caused him no little embarrassment, but it's actually most probable that Hugo was simply unable to hum in tune and didn't like to croak the words to God Save the Queen. So there we are. So that's how unmusical Hugo was. And yet, that does not mean to say that he did not hear in his mind, that he had not memorized, that he could not recall the songs that his characters sing and hear. And it's quite the contrary, because he's 60-ish years old when completing Les Misérables in Hauteville House, and he has in his mind all the hits of his youth, of the period 1815 to 1832, when the action of Les Misérables takes place. That's quite a feat to remember them all, because don't forget, there's no YouTube, there's no vinyl, there's no radio, there's sheet music, of course, but Hugo couldn't read it. So all that I'm going to talk about today really comes from the memory and necessarily the musical memory of Victor Hugo. Now, I can't possibly, and I'm not going to try to give you a catalogue of all the music alluded to or referenced in this 1,500-page novel. So what I'm leaving out are tunes that are just simply mentioned, like La Marseillaise, La Carmagnole, and then a nonsense song sung by Tholomyès' drinking companions, the bagpipes that played at the Battle of Waterloo, obscene songs sort of mentioned as being heard, we don't know which ones, at the Thénardiers. And of course, I'm not going to mention the music of the convent. There must have been lots of it. Then there are obscene songs known to street kids, and then their repertoire of, and so forth. These things that are just simply mentioned as part of the background culture, I'm going to leave out. I'm also not going to say anything about a particular poem. If you remember, towards the end of the novel, when Gilles Lenormand, the Marius's grandfather, is utterly delighted about the marriage that's going to happen between Marius and Cosette, he starts to sing a little song, Jeanne est née à Fougères. Now, these lines, to the best of my knowledge, are not from a popular song. They were written by Victor Hugo, and they allude sort of indirectly to his lifelong lover, Juliette Drouet, who was born in Fougères. So who knows what tune the doting grandfather was using, possibly none at all. It's just a little poem. So it's not an existing song, can't be tracked down, and in all likelihood, Hugo didn't even have a melody in his mind. So that's a no comment. But that leaves an awful lot of stuff. One thing it leaves, of course, is that famous song, the lullaby that Fantine says she sang to Cosette when she was a baby. It's only recalled and recited or given in print when she's dying in hospital in Montreuil-sur-Mer in book 7 of part 1. This also is not a traditional song. It is a poem written by Victor Hugo, and all he says about the melody is that it's the saddest thing you had ever heard. So there is no music, no authentic music to it, but it was set to music in the later 19th century, long after the novel appeared, by a rather lesser composer called Joseph van der Plasche. And so let's listen to van der Plasche's version of it, performed by an operatic soprano who I managed to get involved in this in London and recorded for us. She's not a French speaker, but she does pretty well. Let us see what we have here.
Nous achèterons de bien belles choses en nous promenant le long des faubourgs. Les bleus sont bleus, les roses sont roses, les bleus sont bleus. J'aime mes amours, les bleus sont bleus, les roses sont roses, les bleus sont bleus. J'aime mes amours.
Well, the rest of the music that I'm going to give you today really is in the novel. But first, I'd like to make two sort of general points about music in the 19th century. For novelists like Balzac and Flaubert, musical reference is part of a way of establishing cultural authority. Balzac, for example, gives enthusiastic puffs for Rossini and for Berlioz, who is chums, to show that he knew what the elite was listening to. And Flaubert, you might remember if you've read Madame Bovary, takes Emma to the opera in Rouen to hear Donizetti. And that adds to her characterization as a kind of culture-hungry, upwardly mobile snob at that point in the novel. Now, Hugo in Les Misérables does not do that sort of thing. The musical references are not there to post-cultural legitimacy. With two targeted exceptions, which I will explain, the musical references in Les Misérables do not display knowledge of grand opera or concert music. I mean, Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, Berlioz, and so on, they're entirely absent from this vast novel. As its main topic surely dictates, the music of Les Misérables is the music of ordinary people, of the miserable, and it consists of popular and traditional opera vaudeville, traditional tunes, and it includes folk tunes, children's rhyming songs, hits from comic opera, from vaudeville, from boulevard theatre. Actually, it's slightly artificial to distinguish between these categories because the producers and composers of these popular theatrical entertainments recycled traditional melodies for the numbers that they put on to amuse. And for that reason, the libretti of many pieces of popular music, excuse me, I do still have to read my sheet, are not scored. When you have the printed thing with the lyrics of some vaudeville or piece of popular theatre, over each number to be sung, you just find an indication saying on the air of Au clair de la lune or on an English air. Okay, so leaving the orchestra free to adopt or adapt what they like. Okay. A second point I'd like to make is that there was no copyright in music or in popular theatre in Hugo's day. Composers and playwrights and songsters and so forth borrowed, adapted, transformed, parodied, played around with other people's work. At that level, France, like America and Britain at that time, enjoyed a free culture that we have indeed lost today. Third point, all the music that I found in Les Misérables, and I'll be talking about today, is attached to characters other than the four main male leads. Myriel, Valjean, Javert, and Marius do not hum, sing, whistle. Okay, all the other characters do, but those four do not. I think this is not a coincidence. I think that each of those four people, the priest, the convict, the lover, and the policeman, offer Victor Hugo an imaginary part identity for himself, and their common lack of tunefulness is, I think, a shadow, an indication of the tunelessness of the author who created them. Okay, but as I say, more or less everybody else in the novel does have music attached to them in one way or another. So I'm going to share screen again. This one. Now, the first music I'm going to deal with comes earliest, and actually it's a bit of a cheat because the music is not explicitly heard, but you have to understand what it is to fully grasp one little turn in the novel. It's the point, when Valjean, having received the gift of the candelabra, is on the outskirts of Digne in a moral quandary, and he comes upon a young boy playing with a 2-franc coin. He calls it a 40-sou coin, but 40 sous is 2 francs. And Valjean steals it for no good reason, for no rational reason. Those of you who have had the good fortune to see Claude Lelouch, Les Misérables of the 20th century, which I think is one of the best adaptations of the novel I know, you'll realize that for Lelouch, this is the real beginning of the novel. That's where he starts it. But what Lelouch misses out is the equipment that the lad is carrying on his back. On page 100 of Christine Donagh's translation, that's in chapter 12 of book 2 of part 1, Hugo makes it clear that the boy is, Petit Gervais is his name, is carrying a marmot box and a vielle. Now these accoutrements, as well as the boy's name, make him unmistakably a Petit Savoyard. And here you can see engravings of Petit Savoyard period, and there's one with the marmot box, and the vielle you can't see, but that's part of the vielle that goes with it. So why ever would you carry those two things? What you need to know is this. Prior to the invention of hydroelectricity, tourism and Toblerone, the Alpine region, the high Savoy part of France, which was then of course part of Italy, not part of France, and Switzerland, French-speaking Switzerland, were amongst the poorest parts of Europe, and their main export were boys, young boys, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old boys. And they were exported for a specific purpose, to sweep chimneys. And throughout the 19th century, the word Petit Savoyard is the standard term for a chimney sweep. Now, chimneys can only be swept in the summer when they're not in use, right? And so throughout the winter, what did these little boys do? Well, they earned their crust as buskers, as street entertainers. And what did they entertain with? Well, since they were from the Alps, they carried with them marmots. Marmots are slinky black alpine rodents that have a peculiar ability to be trained, at least to wiggle around as if they were dancing. So they carried these little animals and a musical instrument, and the animals would dance to the musical instrument in the street, and they'd get a sou or two at times, okay? Hugo calls that instrument a vielle, but that is an ambiguous thing. A vielle, a viol, yeah, is the name of a pot-bellied medieval string instrument, but that's not what's meant here. What's meant here is this is a vielle à roue, okay? It's a zither-like instrument. It's got a handle that turns a wheel against two strings that the player controls through these keys, and two other strings sounding a diapason, and it makes a folksy screeching sound. I think of it as sort of halfway between a bagpipe and a harpsichord. The nearest English equivalent is not a hurdy-gurdy, but a dulcy-gurdy. And it's true that Petit Gervais doesn't actually play it in the novel, and I'm cheating a bit. But even so, I thought it would be good for you to know the sort of music that he would have made had Valjean not stolen that 2-franc coin from him. Okay, I'm sure that's enough of the dulcy-gurdy. And there's a picture of one. In the next book, book 2, in 1817 now, because that first book is in 1815, 4 young men, you may recall, take their girlfriends for a day out to Saint-Cloud in the suburbs of Paris, and they all get so jolly that one of them breaks into a song. It's a melancholy tune from Galicia, Soy de Badajoz, Amor me llama. I'm afraid this is another tune that I can't play for you. Footnoters in various editions have suggested that the Spanish is not actually perfect, and that Badajoz is not actually in Galicia. But anyway, none of the footnoters that I've come across have located a melody to which this otherwise unknown ditty might have been set. So like Fantine's lullaby and Gilles Normand's song, it might even have just been written by Hugo himself, who prided himself on retaining knowledge of Spanish from his time in Madrid when he was a boy and his father was Viceroy of Spain. However, the eightsome make their way from the suburbs back into Paris to the Champs-Élysées to Bombardaz restaurant for a bean feast, at the end of which Fantine, Zéphirine, Favorite, and Dahlia get dumped by their boyfriends. But on their way, they come across a group of girls singing in the street. And what are they singing? They sound like children at first because the melody that they're singing is that of a traditional and rather silly rhyme called Rendez-moi mon écuelle de bois, give me back my wooden bowl. But the girls are actually singing to different words. They are singing, give us back notre père de Gand, our father in Ghent. So, needs a bit of explanation. Our father in Ghent is Louis XVIII, the Bourbon monarch, who was restored to the throne, first of all, after Napoleon's abdication in 1814. But then, Napoleon was sent into exile in Elba. But in March 1815, the former emperor escaped, landed on the south coast, marched north, raising an army as he went, and most of Louis XVIII's army simply defected, switched sides back to Napoleon, and joined him, marching further north. So the king, in a panic, fled to Belgium, and indeed to Ghent, Gand. Okay, and all that came to a sorry end at Waterloo on June 18th, June 19th, 1815, when Napoleon was defeated for the last time by the coalition. So the song Our Father in Ghent is a song of that period called the 100 Days of Napoleon's last bid at power, to express allegiance, not to Napoleon, but to the Bourbon monarchy. But in this place, in Book 3 of Part 1, we're actually in 1817, 2 years on, yeah? And the song is still being sung by what I imagine are well-brought-up young girls in the street, and it's become a standard thing. It's actually continues to be sung by the French Army Choir. Whoops, I'm not sure why this is doing that to me, but let's go back here. So this is what this now traditional political song is sounds like when performed, as it were, by a national institution, by the French Army Choir.
Quelle est l'auteur de tous nos malheurs? Ce n'est pas notre Père qui remplit l'univers de fureur. Ce n'est pas notre Père. Quel est celui qui, comme un brigand, a ravagé la terre? Ce n'est pas notre Père de Gand. Ce n'est pas notre Père.
Now, one odd thing about this song is that Rendez-nous notre Père de Gand can be punned. It's not just Our Father in Ghent, but it sounds exactly the same as Père de Gand, a pair of gloves. Give us back our pair of gloves. So Republicans can also sing this song to mock the Bourbon monarchy. And maybe that's what they were doing, the girls in the street were doing in 1817, but not necessarily. Okay, so as you can see, popular songs come from putting new words to old tunes, as we're going to see again and again in this little talk. But now let us move on to the other kind of doing music, of making music, which is putting popular poems to music, inventing tunes to written stuff, to written poems. You may recall that we first meet Madame Thénardier at the inn when Cosette is going on foot, Fantine is going on foot with Cosette from Paris to Montfermeil. And Madame Thénardier is sitting there in the courtyard, swinging her girls on a swing, and she is singing a romance that begins. Il le faut, disait un guerrier, à la belle et tendre Imogine. Those two lines alone allow us to identify the song as the French version of the Ballad of Alonso, the Brave and the Fair Imogine. It's a poem written by Matthew Gregory Lewis in his novel The Monk, the first classic Gothic horror story. And that's the original of it there on the screen, at least at the first version of the first verse. The ballad itself was so popular it was put to music and then performed on stage as a grand ballet at the Haymarket Theatre in London in 1801. It was performed many times thereafter, and obviously it crossed the channel and was performed in Paris. So we know the melody, and what's really curious about it is that this, written melody for a stage show, adapted from a literary novel, a poem inside a novel, has become a folk song. It's become a folk song in its own right. It was brought to the Americas sometime in the 19th century and remains part of the repertoire of the Gaelic-speaking population of Newfoundland in Canada, and it was even recorded in California as a folk song, in 1932. So on the left you have the French lyrics, the actual French lyrics of the song as Madame Thénardier would have known them, but what I'm going to play you is the adapted English lyrics as sung by some hobo in a California parking lot in 1932 and recorded as an oral archive of Californian folk music.
A warrior so brave and a maiden so bright, converse stately sat on the green. They gazed at each other with looks of delight. Alonso the brave was the name of the knight, and the maiden was fair Imogine.
Okay, fascinating. Now, another piece of composed music that migrated, so to speak, from professional stage to popular song is the tune heard by Cosette and her schoolmates in the convent, coming from over the road. You may remember in the chapter about the diversions in the convent. They go up to the attic and they hear this old man practicing on the flute over the way, and they, of course, all fall in love with the music. So it's called Ma Zétulbé vient régner sur mon cœur, Zétulbé, reign over my heart. Now, most footnotes will tell you that this is an aria from Le Calife de Bagdad, the Caliph of Baghdad, which was a comic opera by Boieldieu, otherwise known as the French Mozart, 1800, like so many of these things, with a story based on a story taken from the Arabian Nights. But in fact, it's not quite so simple. The origin of the song, of the tune, is in a different opera, La Scuola dei Maritati, the School of Marriage, by the Spanish Mozart, a slightly early opera. And of course, since he was Spanish, but he's writing an opera, so the lyrics are Italian. It's Guardami un poco da capo a piedi. And that's the original tune. And that aria was added to the Caliph of Baghdad sometime around 1810, and its vocabulary, its lyrics, of course, were changed to fit the new circumstance. And from that source, it seems to become so popular, so well known, that just that in a one-act vaudeville put on in 1819, one of the characters just has to start with the words Ma Zétulbé for the audience to know what song to sing along with. Yeah? It was that sort of a song that you then repeated with the whole audience joining in. So that's the song that the flautist practicing over the road from the back wall of the convent, that's what he was playing. He was reprising it, not from an opera buffa of long ago, but actually from current vaudeville hits on the Boulevard des Italiens, the popular entertainment area of Paris. And so here it is, played just a week ago by Nathalie Berkman in Paris on her flute. So imagine this is what Cosette is listening to, and if you think it a little bit tentative, well, the guy over the road was just practicing. Well, that's for parts 1 and part 2 of the novel. Parts 3 and 4 contain much more music as we get to meet the Thénardier's offspring and, of course, the group of students that gather at the Café Musin and sing songs. The songs sung by those characters, like Notre Père de Gand in Book 2, are clearly political in intent. Even the apolitical, or self-confessedly apolitical and permanently drunk Grantaire is making a political point when he hums away at 2 lines from Vive Henri IV in part 3, book 4, chapter 1. So let me just share that screen again so we can get some info on it. These are the lyrics of the song Vive Henri IV, Vive ce roi vaillant. It's an ancient tune. It praises an early French king for being able to fight, drink, and womanize at the same time. A rather macho vision of what makes a king regal in France. Traditions maintain by some French presidents in the 20th century, but not by the present one. Okay, the point is this. It was adopted by Louis XVIII as the French national anthem because Henry IV, 16th century, was the first French king from the House of Bourbon, which is the house to which Louis XVIII belongs. Louis XVIII was, in fact, the last French monarch of the House of Bourbon. And you need to remember that until 1848, La Marseillaise was not the French national anthem. In fact, it was banned. You weren't allowed to sing it, or you weren't supposed to sing it, because it was heard not as a song of France, but as a song of the Revolution. So when Grantaire drones on, j'aimons les filles et le bon vin, it's obsolete morphology. He's not just saying he likes women and wine. He's saying that his left-wing comrades will have to tolerate a monarchist amongst them, or rather, he's sort of provoking them. He's singing the national anthem. So here's what this stirring song sounds like, again, when performed with period instruments, because it goes back to the 16th century, of course, and a male voice choir. And I'm sure far finer than what Grantaire bored his friends with.
Vive Henri IV, vive ce roi vaillant. Vive Henri IV, vive ce roi vaillant.
So it goes on and on, but that's what he is humming. So I will digress just momentarily. As Hugo was writing these chapters in part 3, Leo Tolstoy, 2,000 miles to the east, was actually almost simultaneously writing his account of the rout of Napoleon's 1812 Russian campaign in that part of War and Peace. At one point in that great novel, which I hope you should read together with Les Misérables, two French soldiers called Ramballe and Morel hide out in the woods, and they nearly die of cold and hunger. And they're rescued by good-hearted Russian peasants. And by way of thanks, Morel teaches his rescuers to sing Vive Henri IV over 3 bowls of kasha and a bottle of vodka. As they bed down for the night, one of the Russians wraps himself in his overcoat and thinks they are men too. War and Peace, Book 15, Chapter 9. So here, a monarchist song, which is just a French song in that rendition of it, brings enemies together, over the boundaries of language, culture, and political allegiance. Okay, so equally political and also equally traditional is the song that Combeferre sings on the staircase as he leaves the meeting, if you remember, in the cafe where Marius has really put his foot in it by praising Napoleon. And, the revolutionaries are not Bonapartists. As with Our Father in Ghent, the melody is traditional and ancient, but we know a bit more about where this one comes from. So let me just share some info with you about Combeferre's song. This song is, and here are the original lyrics, it goes back to about 1550. It's also said that the original words were by the poet Ronsard, which they might be, but that's not actually certain. But it was picked up a century later by Molière. He picked it up in Le Misanthrope in 1666, where he has Alceste, the misery guts, who's the eponymous hero of this comedy. Alceste snarls at the artificial rhymes cooked up to please the fair Célimène by simpering courtiers. He says, old rhymes are better. Yeah? Uncouth as they were, our ancestors were nearer the mark. Their rhymes aren't as rich and the style is old hat, but don't you see, it's far better than that. And what he's referring to as being better is precisely that same song. Now, the original ditty places the love of a woman higher than power and riches. What Combeferre sings to the same tune puts his mother higher than glory. And the reference, quite clearly, is to what Napoleon, codename César, I don't know why this keeps flashing forward, it shouldn't. César is Napoleon, yeah? Si César, if Napoleon had given me. Yeah? And he would put his mother higher than anything Napoleon could give him. In Raymond Bernard's 1934 film adaptation of Les Misérables, the song is given not to Combeferre, but to the whole group of young men around the cafe table. So let's listen to this spirited rendering of an old tune repurposed for a political purpose, reoriented as an anti-Napoleonic song, and as performed in 1834 by a whole group of young men. Here we go.
M'avait donné la gloire et la guerre. Oui, César m'avait donné la gloire et la guerre. Et il me fallut quitter l'amour de ma mère. Et il me fallut quitter l'amour de ma mère. Je dirais au grand César. Reprends cette mon âme, c'est le Dieu ma mère. Oui, c'est le Dieu ma mère. Et ma mère, c'est la République.
Okay, my mother is the Republic. So you see the complete transformation of the meaning of this song in the use made of it in the novel. There's another Russian connection arising from this particular song, perhaps because it is associated in the novel with attachment to the Republic and therefore to revolution. Tatiana Lukashevitz used it in her 1937 Russian adaptation of the Song of Gavroche, to whom it doesn't belong. And if you see the movie, you'll see that it's performed by a child actor with a kind of Cossack dance number and an additional refrain, but it is the same song. as you can hear
Король
here.
наш добрый Дагобер забыл надеть штаны, а без штанов, сознайтесь, вы приходят короли. Ай-тики-дон, ай-тики-ди, не ходят короли. Ай-тики-дон, ай-тики-ди, не ходят короли. Однажды добрый Дагобер охотился в полях, но серый зайчик на него нагнал смертельный страх. Ай-тики-дон, ай-тики-да, нагнал смертельный страх.
Okay, well, I don't think much of the Aït Da, but the rest of it really is the tune of Si le roi m'avait donné, Si César m'avait donné, which is the same tune as Si le roi m'avait donné. Okay. On now to Éponine, who does have songs. She has two, but I'm afraid that the first, J'ai faim mon père, pas de fricot, you know, my belly's empty, pas, which is sung to Marius just as she hands him a note to say that the police are around, yeah, doesn't seem to have been recorded anywhere. It may be that Hugo wrote it himself as an exercise in the slang that he's been keen to teach us in the other chapters of that part of the novel, or maybe it really was a street song that he'd heard and memorized from the streets of Paris. But that's all I can really say about this one. But fortunately, there's much richer background and meaning to Éponine's main aria in the novel. We begin with, again, going back to the 18th century with a piece of pulp fiction, Les Barons de Felsheim, the Barons of Felsheim, by the unstoppable, cynical, Epicurean man about town, Pigault Lebrun, who is actually the model for the senator, if you remember Myriel's conversational sparring partner in the opening chapters of the novel, in the 8th chapter of Book 1 of Part 1. Now, a part of Pigault Lebrun's story was turned into a vaudeville, as happened all the time to novels in this period. Novels went on to stage, called Le Hussard de Felsheim, the Hussar of Felsheim, in 1828. And in that entertainment, which had music as well as acting, the last number was called Nos amours ont duré toute une semaine. Our affair lasted one whole week. And there it was to be sung on un air anglais, an English tune. And we know what that tune is. What that meant was that old song that people of my generation, at least, were taught at school alongside Greensleeves as the ultimate piece of traditional English music. In fact, it's not traditional. It's the work of a composer, Charles Edwin Horne, and the lyrics are from a poem by a considerable poet called Herrick. But it migrated very quickly from composition into folk tune. The lyrics sung by Éponine to this English tune, and which were presumably the works of the librettists of the vaudeville, also have their strange history, or post-history. Balzac incorporated them into his portrait of La Grisette, you know, the woman of easy virtue, in a short piece that he wrote, a caricatural piece that he wrote for a journal called La Caricature. And then you also find lithographs of and drawings of grisettes, of prostitutes and women of the streets in that period, by Schaeffer and Philippon, under titles taken from that song, La Semaine des Amours, or Nos amours ont duré, and so forth, which may in fact be the source rather than the consequence of the popularity of the last aria of this popular opera. So all this is to say, when Éponine sings in chapter 16 of Book 8 of Part 3, what she's doing is simultaneously reprising a hit from the vaudeville, singing a tune recognized as an English folk tune, though it was not that, and above all, she's singing, so to speak, the theme tune of The Woman of the Streets of the last years of the 1820s and early 1830s. So it's exactly right for the timing of the chapter, and it's also quite sad, given that it identifies her as a girl with only one future. So let's have a listen to Éponine singing.
Nos amours ont duré toute une semaine, mais que tout bonne les instants sont courts. S'adorer 8 jours, c'était bien la peine. Le temps des amours devrait durer toujours. Devrait durer toujours, devrait durer toujours.
Now, Éponine's nemesis, our heroine Cosette, is the one female lead in Les Misérables who does not sing, but who does play a musical instrument. Why? Well, you need some explanation for that. You might have expected a young lady of the period brought up in a convent school and living in some comfort with Monsieur Leblanc in Rue Plumet to play the piano, as most middle-class young ladies at least tried at that time. Indeed, Victor Hugo's own daughter, Adèle, was an accomplished pianist and a composer. Her music's only recently been performed, as you can see. The first public performance was last year in Guernsey. So, to satisfy this rather difficult young woman, who was at the time in love with a most unsuitable suitor, Victor Hugo had a concert piano shipped over at great expense and installed on the second floor of Hauteville House. He hated the sound of the instrument. He said hated hearing his daughter practicing and practicing. It interrupted his writing of Les Misérables, and he came to despise the piano as a piano. He regarded as a newfangled contraption that spoiled the music played on it. So in part 4, which is where we are now, book 5, chapter 2, he gives his adoptive daughter Cosette a different sound, a different instrument, the piano orgue. And there is one. Despite the translators have had great difficulty with this, I don't quite know why. Donneger calls it a piano organ, which isn't anything that ever existed. Piano orgue is simply the word for harmonium. And it's odd that we don't get it right in most of the English translations, because harmoniums were actually much more popular in the United States than they were in France by the end of the 19th century. So that's what Cosette is playing. And we know what she was playing. She was playing an aria from Carl Maria von Weber's romantic opera Euryanthe from 1823, widely reprised in concerts throughout Europe over the following years. It's known as the Hunter's Chorus in English, Chasseurs égarés dans les bois in French, and you have the original German is given to you by Christine Donneto. I don't know why you should do that, but never mind. It is often played on horns and trumpets, and these are sounds which a harmonium can, well, if not actually create, it can sort of imitate them. Okay, so here we have Hugo's first targeted exception to the use of exclusively popular melodies in Les Misérables. And yes, it's targeted because it signals Cosette's ascent into the culture of the bourgeoisie, but only just because it's a very popular tune all the same. So here it is, played on French horns, and something like the sound that Cosette might have got out of her harmonium. Whoops. Okay, one morning though, Cosette gets to hear things far less polite and melodious. Out at the crack of dawn for a walk with her father, she's witness to the ordeal that he had experienced more than 30 years earlier. The transportation of convicts at the start of a 27-day journey to the Bagne in Toulon. They're sitting on benches facing outwards on carts drawn by oxen. And believe it or not, they are singing at the top of their raucous voices. The tunes, again, are hits from a recent vaudeville piece, La Vestale, by Desaugiers. Desaugiers was the musical director of one of the theatres of Paris, and his mock operas were also published as books. So we have access to the librettos, but again, as was typical, the libretti were not scored. For each of the numbers, the text simply states which traditional melody is to be used, including folk tunes, drinking songs, which I've given you a list of those that are in the libretto like that. So they're all part of kind of common ancient public repertoire. And it's quite interesting when you think that these convicts who are mocking their own cruel plight by singing hits from a comic opera are at the same time resurrecting music with deep popular roots. So I thought you might like to listen just a little to two of these melodies that these poor convicts are belting out as kind of defiance of their fate. That's V'là ce que c'est que d'aller au bois, and what a jolly tune it is. And this is Dans les gardes françaises. A thumpy old tune, you can well imagine that, keeping the crowd entertained in a vaudeville and being thumped out by these transportees. Okay. So now we get to the most musical of all the characters, that tuneful brat Gavroche. And by my reckoning, there are 5 specific songs attributed to him, alongside his sort of general repertoire of dirty ditties. We hear him almost as soon as we meet him, teasing the locataire principale, Madame Brugnon, at the Gorbeau tenement. And what we hear is a very familiar tune. It's called Le Roi Coup de Sabot, or King Kicker in the Donahoe translation. And that is actually to be sung to the tune of Yankee Doodle. Not as a nod to the United States, not at all. The tune is far older and was first attested in the Netherlands in the late medieval period. So I'll spare you a performance of the French to the tune that you all know, but I'll just, if I may, just give you a whistle of Yankee Doodle, and imagine that these are the lyrics that Gavroche sings to this melody, to this tune, in order to get up Madame Brugnon's nose. Okay, the next time he sings, he uses another common as dirt tune, Au clair de la lune, but he changes the words in order to make a political point. That's because Bugeaud, my dear friend Bugeaud, yeah, he's a Napoleonic soldier who'd become a member of parliament, and in 1834 he took personal command of the detachment that slaughtered protesters in the Rue Transnonain, of which Daumier made a lithograph, and which often decorates Les Misérables, even though it's slightly anachronistic. So in this part of the novel, it's situated in 1832. Bugeaud doesn't actually have any gendarmes at his disposal. At any rate, as with many of the songs of the street, what we hear is a political barb set to an ancient tune. So listen to it. Not long after, Gavroche is on scene again, just as his sister Eponine lies dying, and he sings a song that was very popular at that time, En voyant Lafayette. Le gendarme répète, Sauvons-nous, sauvons-nous, sauvons-nous. Lafayette was a hero of the American War, a French hero of the American War of Independence, and he remained, as it were, the living conscience of the First French Revolution through his long life. And when he was a man of great age already, he appeared on the balcony of the town hall at the height of the July Revolution of 1830, and it seemed for a moment as if he was going to be the head of a new republic. That didn't happen. A coterie of bankers brought in another king, Louis Philippe, to replace the disgraced Charles X. So the song, En voyant Lafayette, expresses the attitude of the timid bourgeois of that moment of July 1830. On seeing Lafayette, the gendarme says, let's get out of here. Now, that refrain was invented by a rather remarkable figure, Charles Durand. He was a chef and a cafe owner, a restaurant owner, well known for it was a popular restaurant. It was cheap and good, so forth. And as patron of the establishment, Durand also entertained his customers with songs, the singing chef, many of which he wrote himself. But as we've seen before, 19th century songsters almost always borrowed their tunes from elsewhere. And in this case, for the En voyant Lafayette ditty, he borrowed it from a popular opera, Fra Diavolo, Brother Devil, by Daniel Aubert, after whom Place Aubert, the metro station in Paris, is named. So we therefore know the tune that Gavroche sings, and quite surprisingly, we can hear it sung in English with the wordage by Yonder Rock Reclining, but it really is the tune of En voyant Lafayette, in a film adaptation of Fra Diavolo by none other than Laurel and Hardy, who in the credits for that film call themselves Stanley-O and Ollie-O. So here's Stanley-O and Ollie-O singing the English translation of the original song which Charles Durand adapted and that Gavroche sings to tease the pusillanimous bourgeois and non-unrepublican bourgeois of 1830 Paris.
On yonder rock reclining, the bandit stands. In his hand his carbine holds, 'tis his best friend of all. Tremble! Meanwhile the storm is beating, while here echo repeating, Diavolo.
Gavroche's next ditty is a nonsense song with the refrain Où vont les belles filles, which he sings as he walks back towards the barricade from Rue de l'Homme Armé at the very end of part 4. It's not clear that Hugo had any tune in mind. It was put to music in 1910 by Charles Lecoq, but I'm not going to play you that. I'll pass on that one today. But it's after the first big onslaught on the barricade, when he's going over the other side to collect ammunition, that Gavroche sings a song for which he is best remembered, La Faute à Voltaire. And this song has a long and very political history. And we have to go back from June 1832 all the way to 1817, early years of the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. France was a divided country. The newly dominant monarchists thought that the dreadful events of the past, Revolution, Napoleon, and so forth, had all been prepared and encouraged by the writings of the 18th century philosophes, especially the godless Voltaire and the revolutionary Rousseau. But, of course, there was a large faction as well who held on the contrary view that republicanism had been betrayed and defeated only by foreign powers, and that it would stage a comeback sometime soon. And among these die-hard Republicans were publishers who wanted to launch a new cheap edition of the complete works of Voltaire and the complete works of Rousseau for the education of the masses and the preparation of the coming revolution. The political and the ecclesiastical authorities were horrified at this proposal, and the administrative head of the Catholic Church, the Vicar General, sent a letter to parish priests, instructing them to use their sermons to dissuade their flock from subscribing to or purchasing or even having anything to do with such terrible books. Now, this did not go down well in Protestant Geneva. Rousseau was a native Genevan. Voltaire had lived in Ferney, just over the road from Geneva. And so a local entertainer called Jean-François Chaponnière mocked the Vicar General with a set of satirical stanzas, all ending with the refrain, car il dit à son troupeau, he told his flock, s'il est du mal sur la terre, if there's any evil on earth, c'est la faute de Voltaire, it's Voltaire's fault, it's Rousseau's fault, okay? It's like what you know, but not quite the same. Shortly after, Pierre-Louis Béranger, a very popular poet and songwriter in Paris, picked up the idea from his Genevan colleague and wrote a longer and even more anti-clerical ditty with the same couplet in the refrain, but in a slightly different way. Eve enjoyed the fruit, Rousseau's fault. Cain killed Abel, Voltaire's fault, and so on it goes. Okay, so, now, we don't know what tune Chaponnière used, but Béranger most certainly used a traditional tune called Allons la voir à Saint-Cloud, and there it is. That's the score of the song that we're talking about. It's taken from La Clé du Caveau that I know some of you have come across. It's absolutely invaluable compendium of the repertoire of 19th century cabaret songs. Now, this song, Béranger's song, became so famous that it was even imitated in England years later as a conservative response to the reform movement. So here's a version of it. Britain's now astir all over, all complaining and conspiring. And from John o' Groats to Dover, demagogues all hearts are firing. Ask you, whence hath come the storm? All is owing to reform. If the people rage and fume, 'tis the fault of Henry Broome. You have to have a Scots accent to get the rhyme right. It's an imitation of Béranger, exactly the same period when Gavroche is singing this song on the barricades. So, as you can see, Hugo is not the first to reprise Béranger's imitation of Chaponnière. But obviously he did not give Gavroche the same words or quite the same refrain. First of all, Gavroche doesn't rhyme on religious or political references, he just uses place names from the banlieue, from the surrounds of Paris, one of which had already been listed among the outer limits of the Paris urchin's universe. Second, Gavroche does not sing La faute de Voltaire that we have seen previously in all the earlier versions. He sings La faute à Voltaire. There's a difference, there's an important thing to it. In standard French, the genitive, the possessive case, is expressed by de, yeah, la plume de ma tante, is obvious. But in a more familiar register, and especially in children's speech, possession can be expressed, often is expressed by à and not de. When you say, c'est mon vélo à moi, it's my bicycle, or c'est son truc à lui, it's his thing, right? So having Gavroche use this lower register form in La faute à Voltaire is absolutely perfect, it's absolutely right, because it marks him as a child, which is fine, and also as a child of the people. So that it underlines all that Hugo has to say in the novel about the beauty and interest of argot, of slang, of popular speech. But there is also another technical advantage. Those mute E's at the ends of French words are pronounced in French verse as a syllable if they're followed by a consonant, but they're left silent if they are followed by a vowel. Okay? So Béranger's C'est la faute de Voltaire has 7 syllables, but Hugo, who was brilliant at French verse, turns it into a 6-syllable expression, C'est la faute à Voltaire. because the E at the end of the line is silent, whatever you do. French poetry is typically written in 12-syllable lines divided into two halves of 6 each. So by this little trick, Hugo turns Gavroche into a poet, into a boy who can come up with well-formed half-lines, hemistiches, in the kind of verse that Hugo could, of course, write in his sleep. So now we know why Gavroche sings what he sings. It's an anti-clerical satire repurposed to the defense of the Republic, and we know why it's not the same as Béranger's. It's to make it fit the authentic language of a child of the streets, and we also know the tune. Here it is in a soulless rendering by a computer whilst waiting for one of you to perform it more appropriately. I'm near the end. Last musical reference in the novel, apart from the violins and flutes playing Haydn at the wedding of Marius and Cosette, and that's the second exception to the absence of elite music in the novel, isn't sung, it's whistled, and it's heard, and it's made sense of by, well, guess who? Boulatruelle, that murky member of Patron Minette, who's also a road mender at Montfermeil. He's out in the woods one day and thinks he catches sight of the mysterious ghost who, according to local legend, has buried treasure somewhere nearby. In fact, it's not a ghost, it is actually Valjean. He's returning to rescue his 640,000 francs buried in a tin in the woods. Somewhere in the distance, there is a hunter whistling a tune that Boulatruelle knows, as do all French school children, since it's a folk tune that's been known for hundreds of years. But Boulatruelle also knows the words, and as readers, we need to know them too. So here they are in all their nonsensical charm, and as you can see, a little man called Guillery went off hunting, and he climbed a tree. So it's when Boulatruelle hears this whistle that it occurs to him that he might actually see his ghost better if he climbs a tree. And that's what he does. But he still doesn't actually manage to track down Valjean. Okay, so let's just have a listen to this children's rhyme and to realize that, the reference to it and it being whistled requires us to actually know what's in the song, because otherwise Boulatruelle's climbing a tree would have no obvious sense.
Petit homme qui s'appelait Guy Carbi, il s'enfuit à la chasse au père des Carbi, Titi Carbi, Toto Carbo, père Guéry. Te laisseras-tu mourir?
There you are, and very silly it is too, and that is the end of the music in Les Misérables, but I'm sorry, I have to give you a little appendix, a really important appendix. The very first musical version of Les Misérables was almost contemporary with it. It was not done in France, but here in the United States. Now, the first full translation of Les Misérables appeared within 6 months, by the end of 1862. And in the early weeks of 1863, it was already adapted by a composer called Charles Copitz, and he put on a show called Fantine in Philadelphia. It was never published, but as luck would have it, the original score was kept in the storeroom of a theatre, the Boston Theatre, and it ended up, when that theatre closed, all its archives were transferred to the Horton Library at Harvard University, and that's where I was lucky enough to find it. So let's have a listen to the curtain raiser of the very first musical called Fantine, first performed in Philadelphia in 1863. This really is a first. I don't think anybody has heard this for more than a century and a half, and it's a pretty rousing starter. Here we go, and here he comes. Well, there's plenty more where that came from. As you can see, the score is quite long, and so I'd like to encourage you all to think about how you might actually redo Les Misérables on stage with the material I've given you, and please be in touch if you would like more info and more material. Thank you very much. Here are some of the people I need to thank, and some more, especially Abigail Litvak, who actually made that recording of the opening of the absolutely first Fantine musical in the world. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.